Hi, welcome to the Ellis Talker Show. I'm DV LeBron. Today, my very special guest is former senior advisor to the Secretary of Defense, a distinguished Army colonel retired, Mr. Douglas Macgregor. How you doing, sir?
Good, good. Happy to be with you.
Sir, it is an honor to have you on because I wanted your insights into what's going on geopolitically that affects the U.S. Very much because there's a lot going on out there. But I first wanted my audience, and first I wanted to commend you for your service, sir. As a Navy man, I really appreciate you. Thank you, sir. Um, I wanted to have you introduce yourself to my audience.
Oh, well, listen, nobody remembers most of that stuff. Let's just say, I spent 28 years in the Army, and I was fortunate to serve with wonderful people and saw a lot of action. And I was sorry to leave it when I did, but I didn't have any choice. I need to go on and do other things. But since then, I've ended up in a number of interesting places with different people, both in Europe and the United States and the Middle East. And so I've tried to stay in touch with events. And so if I can provide you with any background on some of the larger issues that confront us, then I'm happy to do so.
Well, yes, I definitely want to talk about that. So we have China preparing for Taiwan. We have, now
Can
Israel
I
is.
interrupt you for a second?
Yes, of course.
There is no evidence that China is preparing to do anything with Taiwan. That's pure nonsense.
Excellent. And that's why I wanted you on because that's why I wanted you on. So you have this thing going on in Ukraine with Russia, and we're being fed all this different information that the Ukrainians are beating up on the Russians, and it to me it looks more like a war of attrition. So tell me, what do you see coming out of this mess that is Ukraine?
Well, let's first of all get our facts straight because unfortunately, the American people, and I think many Europeans, certainly in Western Europe, but not exclusively, Europe in general, have been fed a lot of information that is simply false. The Russians were goaded by us for years over Ukraine, and they finally said enough's enough, and they intervened. They intervened because we were building a force in eastern Ukraine designed to attack Russia. And we had installed a puppet regime in Kiev that was brought to power by the CIA. And we then capitalized on whatever hostility we could cultivate in Ukraine. And the outcome is this terrible war, which the Ukrainians have lost. The war is a catastrophe for Europe, but especially for the people of Ukraine. We now know that at least 600,000 Ukrainian soldiers have been killed in less than 3 years. Those are World War I levels of loss. This is something that we did not see in the short period of time, this kind of devastation, even during World War II. The Ukrainian nation is practically destroyed. Millions and millions of Ukrainians have left the country. They were already leaving in great numbers before the war began to get away from this hopeless despair that comes with the corruption in that country. But now it's very unlikely that we're going to see very many people go back. So you're talking about a nation that originally was at the beginning of this thing, perhaps as many as 40 million, maybe 35 million. We're now looking at less than 17 million or 16 million remaining in rump Ukraine, that is Ukraine west of the Dnieper. The Russians, at the same time, have probably sustained perhaps 80 to 100,000 casualties, of which 50 to 60,000 are dead. So that gives you some sort of appreciation for the difference in losses. The losses sustained by Ukraine are horrific. The losses that the Russians have taken over the last 3 years have been actually quite modest compared with the Ukrainian losses. The Russians want to end this war. They never really wanted to fight it. When they first went in, there was a very small Russian force that was used because, frankly, the Russian military and its army especially were not particularly large. They discovered that we had poured billions of dollars in terms of training and equipment into this Ukrainian force. And their concern was that at some point we would put missiles into eastern Ukraine that could threaten Russian cities and ultimately Russia's nuclear deterrent. That's why they went in. They also went in because the Russian people that live in eastern Ukraine, and I would say that more than half of the people living in eastern Ukraine are Russians who speak Russian, are culturally Russian, ethnically Russian, were being treated as second-class citizens. In fact, I would go even further and say probably third-class citizens. They were actively oppressed and mistreated and brutalized. All of this brought about the current crisis in the war. And once the war began and it became clear that we had invested very heavily in this Ukrainian force and that we were prepared to effectively provide limitless support in terms of equipment, resources, advice, and access to high technology to the Ukrainians, the Russians made a decision to effectively go over to the defensive until they had built a force large enough and powerful enough to defeat the enemy. That has now happened. The Ukrainians are defeated. And there is no chance for Ukraine to win this conflict. It's over. The fact that we continue to sustain them with money means that we are paying for the Ukrainian military, what's left of it. We are paying the Ukrainian government, and we have lost tens of billions of dollars, much of which is probably residing in banks in places like Cyprus or Albania or elsewhere in the world, because Ukraine is probably one of the most corrupt, if not the most corrupt country in the world. We don't know how many tens of thousands of children and women have disappeared from Ukraine as a result of human trafficking, but the whole thing is nothing less than a horror show. We are not in any position now to challenge the Russians for control of Ukraine, period, let alone eastern Ukraine. Their force is far larger, better equipped, better trained, obviously better led than our own forces. NATO is a collection of cats. Think of a herd of cats and how difficult it is to herd cats. Well, that's NATO. NATO is a very, very complex, very diverse group of people, and the overwhelming majority want nothing to do with a war against Russia. And so if anything else occurs, I suspect that before the next year or two is out, this thing we call NATO will cease to exist. Our position in Europe will be destroyed as the Europeans discover that we brought on this war and that we have inadvertently destroyed their economies as well, especially Germany, which was once perhaps the second or third most powerful scientific industrial power in the world, has now been reduced to poverty and ruin. The German people are suffering not just from a lack of work in terms of joblessness because their industries have shut down and gone out of business. They don't have access to the inexpensive energy they once did. And as a result, the greatest power in Europe and really the economic backbone of the European community is destroyed. I don't know. It'll take decades for the Europeans to come back out of this thing. And I think before it's over, we will be about as popular as the plague for having brought this on.
Colonel, what is the end game now that this is all out there? And I mean, eventually we're going to see it's going to become, they're not going to be able to ignore what's happening in Ukraine. I mean, if all this is happening and they've lost this war, eventually it's going to come out. So
yes,
what is the end game? How does that affect us as far as the country and our geopolitical problems?
Well, I think the end game is disastrous for us because we will ultimately be blamed for this failure, this tremendous strategic debacle that we've created. It's going to become obvious to Europeans that there was no threat from Russian invasion, that the Russians do not threaten Europe today, nor do they have any interest in threatening Europe. They would like to do business with Europe. And the Europeans would like to get back to business with the Russians. They had a very mutually beneficial economic arrangement, particularly between Germany and Russia. That's what people are going to want to get back to. On the other hand, people are going to begin to question what's the purpose of having this U.S. military establishment and diplomatic presence in our countries when the only thing the Americans seem to be interested in doing is starting wars and dragging us into them. So I think we will eventually be invited to leave. How soon will that happen? I think it'll begin as soon as the truth sinks in. And thus far, what's amazing has been our ability, working closely between the CIA and MI6, the intelligence branch in London, to create these false narratives, to create the illusion that we were doing something good when we were doing something very bad. And as a result, when that happens, yes, I think our position in Europe is about done. It's about finished.
How close
Now,
are we to a hot war with Russia?
I don't think we're very close because we have no way to fight one. I mean, if you take all that there is in the regular army right now that can fight, most of it is sitting along 1,000-kilometer front from Romania all the way up to the border with Finland. It's piecemeal, it's fragmented, it's woefully under-equipped, it's underprepared, it's not properly trained. Our training and advice to the Ukrainians has been disastrous. It has caused them unbelievable casualties. We're not ready to fight anybody right now, certainly not the Russians. So I don't think that's likely to happen. And as deranged and corrupt as I think Washington is at this point, I don't think they're foolish enough to threaten a nuclear exchange with Russia, because everyone knows what a nuclear exchange with Russia would create. It would be the end of us. The world that we know would cease to exist. So I don't think that's likely. And I think increasingly the attention is going to refocus now on the Middle East. We are already shifting whatever resources and munitions and capabilities we have to Israel, that is engaged in building the foundation for a regional war against all of Islam. That's where we're headed in the Middle East. And the principal goal that Mr. Netanyahu has is very similar to Mr. Zelensky's goal. Mr. Zelensky's goal was always to drag us into war with Russia on his behalf. That has failed. That's not going to happen. Now, Mr. Netanyahu is desperate to drag us into war against all of his erstwhile enemies, which means virtually everybody in the Middle East, and expect us to destroy them for Israel. And we are poised to do that. We are poised right now to attack Iran and potentially Hezbollah and presumably anybody else who decides to raise objections to what Israel is doing in Gaza. And we need to understand that what Israel has done in Gaza is nothing less than a campaign of mass murder and expulsion that has probably killed somewhere in the neighborhood of 200,000 men, women, and children in Gaza, with the goal of ethnically cleansing all the Arabs who are on the borders of Israel or sitting inside Israel to create this ethnically pure Jewish power state. They're now turning on Hezbollah, which they have contributed enormously to in terms of building it up as an enemy. And they seem to be intent on destroying Lebanon and driving everyone that is close to the border with Israel in southern Lebanon completely out of the area. That's going to be very difficult, because Hezbollah has a lot of military capability that has been built up over many years. And they are currently firing at the Israelis about 400 missiles a day. And the Israeli air and missile defenses are largely, not completely, but largely exhausted, because when a missile flies towards Israel, the predisposition is to fire at least 2 or 3 anti-missiles at the incoming missile. Well, that's an exchange rate that's very, very difficult to sustain. And we ourselves are very short on missiles and rockets and munitions. We've turned an awful lot over to Ukraine. We don't have a great deal to send to Israel. And we're trying to build more, but we don't have any surge capacity. We are simply not prepared for a major war. And yet that is exactly what we're poised to become part of in the Middle East. And the danger, of course, is that if Iran is drawn in, and I think it's almost a certainty that it will be, because I don't think the Iranians are going to sit quietly and watch what happened in Gaza happen to southern Lebanon. They're not going to allow the people in southern Lebanon to be butchered and driven out of their homes the way the Arabs in Gaza have been butchered and driven from their homes. So I think ultimately Iran will engage, and then we are poised to attack Iran on behalf of Israel and to support the Israelis. Now, what happens beyond that is hard to tell, but I don't think Russia or China will sit quietly and watch us destroy Iran. Now, we have to understand that the oil and natural gas that comes out of through the Straits of Hormuz from the Persian Gulf is enormously important, not just to China, but to Japan, to Korea, to most of the people in Northeast Asia. they're not going to allow that to be stopped. And that's something that would probably be stopped. We already see the consequences of blocking the Suez Canal and traffic in the Red Sea. It's catastrophic. It's not just a question of stopping commerce, but you have to pay insurance rates for all of the oil tankers and other kinds of freighters that move at sea, and no one wants to pay those rates. And so everything is now delayed, and people are sailing all the way around the tip of Africa in order to reach Europe. So that kind of disaster could also befall the Straits of Hormuz. And finally, Iran has an important role to play in the region. Iran is a nation of about 79 million people. If you eliminate Iran or destroy it, make it uninhabitable, then you end up in a situation where others will fill that void, and they could be more powerful and more dangerous than anything you've seen thus far. And again, that also means millions of people who then begin to move north to try and get out of Iran, to go where there's water, where there's food, where there's safety. In other words, the capacity to disrupt life and civilization in the Middle East right now is substantial. So I and many others, I think, have said, I think Larry Wilkerson has said this, as well as many others, that we should be interested in putting an end to this Israeli war. We have to make it clear that we cannot allow the entire region to be disrupted or destroyed, and that there has to be an alternative to mass murder. That's not a solution in this day and age. But thus far, this government has refused to even consider that. So it's a very dangerous period in the Middle East.
How could we stop that, Colonel? I mean, how do we, at this point, how do we get Netanyahu to stop going? Because you're right, Iran's going to get into it. They're going to have to, and it's going to become a mess. I believe that, and I'm not as learned as you, but I can see the writing on the wall. I've been out there. I can see the writing on the wall. And if you're starting to attack Hezbollah, things start changing. And so how do we convince Netanyahu this has to stop, and what does stop look like?
You suspend all military aid to Israel immediately.
Wow.
That is the only thing that will stop Netanyahu and the Israeli state and its current course of action. You have to make it clear that we will not support this. And I think that would have happened almost under every president that I can think of since the end of the Second World War. At one point or another, Eisenhower, Kennedy, Johnson, Nixon, Carter, all of them have intervened at some point and said enough's enough. Even George Bush and W., his son, when he was in office, put a stop to things that the Israelis were prepared to do in Gaza back during the Bush administration. We simply said, wait a minute. We support Israel. We believe Israel has every right to exist, and we want to help the Israelis live in security and safety and be prosperous. But that doesn't include unconditional support for anything the Israelis want to do, either to the people living on their soil who are Arabs or to their neighbors. Yeah. There's a difference. And right now, they have unconditional support from the United States to do whatever they want. And so you're looking at what people are calling in the United Nations and in the International Criminal Court genocide, the mass extermination of people in Israel that the Israelis want to get rid of. Very simple. They want to rid themselves of these Arabs, Muslims and Christian Arabs. They want them out. And they're not going to stop there. They're going to go into the West Bank, and they're going to go into southern Lebanon. And anybody who disagrees with them is immediately branded an anti-Semite.
Yeah.
Which, of course, is absurd. Yeah. Nobody that I know is interested in harming Jews. That doesn't mean that they support harming Arabs or anybody else.
How much has
the 21st century, isn't it? Isn't this 2024? Haven't we figured this out?
Yeah. Well, you would think, but these things are cyclical. They keep repeating themselves because, people just let them. But how much of this that's going on and all this stuff we've been talking about, how much of this is attributed to weak leadership?
Well, let's define weak leadership. Donald Trump, and I have a great deal of affection for President Trump. I work for him and I like him. But there's this notion of, well, you have to be strong. Well, being strong means saying no to the Israelis. Unfortunately, people think saying no means supporting military action against anybody you don't like. We've wasted a lot of time, money, and resources on the notion that every time we bomb someone somewhere, and most of the time we bomb people that couldn't defend themselves, that we are somehow or another greater as a result of having done it. That bombing and destroying other people's countries makes us great. I disagree with that. Eisenhower didn't agree with that. And Eisenhower was certainly in a better position to understand warfare and what makes someone great or not than anybody we've had in the presidency since. So I think we got to be careful. Is Biden weak? Well, perhaps he's weak, but your government is currently owned by the Israel lobby. They control the Congress. They control the Senate. They control the House. They have a great deal of money behind them. And that money does not come from overseas. That money comes from within the United States, from very, very wealthy donors that support Israel and the Israel lobby. And if you stand up to them, they put all of the money at their disposal to elect your opponent, whoever that is. They're very open-minded. They don't care about Democrats and Republicans. They just want people who are going to do whatever they say. And that means support whatever Israel and Mr. Netanyahu wants. That's the situation. So we don't really control our government at this point. And if you look at the most strident advocates for the destruction of Arab life, Muslim life, whatever it is in the Middle East, or Iranians or anybody else, those people are rewarded handsomely with enormous amounts of money for their reelection campaigns to keep their seats and ultimately to benefit in the private sector from enormously lucrative deals that make them millionaires. It's no secret that most people that come to the House, for instance, do not show up as millionaires, but they sure leave that way.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, they were tracking that was the thing, tracking Nancy Pelosi's stock things. And this is a question I can ask you because you have time and experience on this earth, sir. And is there ever going to be a president that can get into office and stop this?
Well, that's a good question because I don't see it stopping under President Trump. I think President Trump is very beholden right now to the same people. What he will do, I think, is pull the plug on this Ukrainian fiasco. I think he will do that. How rapidly, how quickly, how decisively, I can't forecast, but I think he will do what he can to diffuse that situation and get out of the Ukrainian mess that we're in. As far as what happens in Europe at that point, I don't think he can rescue our position in Europe strategically. We've done so much damage to ourselves, it's not going to improve. But when it comes to the Middle East, that's a different animal because he's very dependent upon the same sources of money that so many other people are in Washington. So it's going to be very difficult for him to deal with that. Now, let me just add something else here that deserves some attention. We haven't talked about the open borders and the millions of people pouring into the country, about the rise in criminality, particularly in our big cities, but now even in the rural areas. Everybody knows that fentanyl is killing over 110,000 Americans every year. No one brings it up or discusses it very often in Washington. A lot of military power is needed on that border. But there are foolish people in Washington who talk about bombing Mexico. They don't seem to understand that bombing Mexico is not going to help us at home. In other words, if we shut down the drug trafficking into the United States, we're going to have a war inside our own country with the various drug cartels and mafias that have profited enormously from the drug trade. But bombing people on the other side of the border isn't going to help us. But the same mentality that promotes stupid behavior overseas in places like Europe or the Middle East, that's present right now in Washington in private discussions. Well, we just need to attack Mexico and get rid of these mafias down there and so forth. Well, good luck with that. How are you going to separate millions of people who live in that country from organized crime? Good luck. That's not an answer. But that's the same sort of stupid thinking that drives so much of what's wrong in our foreign policy. We haven't even talked about China.
Did we learn? Have we learned our lessons? And I know the answer to this, but I really want your input on it. Have we learned the lessons that we learned from Iraq? That you can't keep trying to build what you perceive as good, or bringing democracy everywhere. Have we learned from that fiasco?
I think the short answer is really no. We're the microwave culture. Just as we go to the closet or to the refrigerator, we pull out something, we shove it in the microwave. 2 or 3 minutes later, we have a piping hot dinner. Unfortunately, that same mentality translates into stupid policies that assume that in the space of a few years, with the investment of several $billions, that people around the world can be transformed into Anglo-Saxon Democrats. It's absurd. It's nonsensical. The whole problem in Iraq from the very beginning was not with removing Saddam Hussein. That was not that difficult. Replacing him with another group of Iraqi generals was eminently doable. We could have left the Iraqi military intact and its administration. We could have turned to the United Nations and said, we'll support you to come in and help these people hold elections or do whatever is necessary to put a government into power. But the U.S. military was never the answer to do any of those things. And yet that's exactly what we turn to, because people have no patience and they are quick to opt for force, the use of force, to try and push something into existence that otherwise wouldn't be there. And I don't think we've learned that lesson. Now, the average American, if you and I got most Americans, whether they're in San Antonio, Texas, or Boston or Chicago or anywhere, and we put 50 of them in a room, we presented the facts, they'd all reach the right conclusions. The problem is we don't present those facts. What we hear are emotional arguments that sound great until you begin to peel away the various layers of nonsense and discover the lies beneath. That's difficult. And Americans, as you know, they're trying to put food on the table. The average American is busy working. When he comes home at night, he doesn't want to have to think about a lot of complex issues. He wants to open a can of beer, sit in the sofa, watch the football game or something, talk to his kids, help them with their homework, whatever, and then go to sleep and get up the next morning, go back to work. We can't expect Americans to have all the answers and understand everything. But the problem is that we've enjoyed our lives here so much for so long that we have tended to be complacent. We've tended to think, well, the people we elected, they're really good people and they're working for us. No, they're not. That's the problem. They're working for their donors. That's how they become millionaires. And that's the problem. And fixing that is not easy.
No. I wanted, because we're running out of time a little bit, and I could talk to you forever. But China, I wanted to get to that because there's a perception, and I got to be honest, I have a perception about China, but I've been fed this. Millions and millions of dollars went into what I think about China. So educate me. What's happening with China, and
well,
are we prepared?
the first thing we need to understand is if you're concerned about the Chinese inside our country, which is, in my judgment, a valid concern. I mean, the Chinese have been stealing us blind in terms of intellectual property, science, and technology for years. That's because we allowed it. We had Chinese professors, scientists, working in our nuclear laboratories under Bill Clinton. And when we finally discovered they were there, they were arrested, and eventually we deported these people, but we never fixed the problem. If you're going to have open borders, you're going to let anybody who wants to come into the United States to enter it, then you're going to have a big problem with something called the rule of law. You're going to have a problem with national security. The Chinese have a reputation in Asia for the last 2,000 years of stealing everything they can get their hands on and sending it home. If it looks like it might be good, send it back to China. Whenever a Chinese leaves China, that's what he's told on the way out. Now, don't you forget, you're Chinese. When you get there and you find something, you send it home. We don't have big problems with the Japanese. We very rarely have problems with Koreans, but we have big problems with Chinese. That's because when Koreans come here, the Japanese come here, they didn't come here to steal anything. Usually they've come here to build a life, to set up a business, to make money. Some of them become Americans, and then some of them just go back eventually. But we haven't had the kind of problem we do with the Chinese. The Chinese build China inside our borders. That's the problem. And they're not the only ones, but they're the most egregious problem. So the first thing you've got to do, you have to halt immigration. Just stop it. We don't know who's in this country. We know that at least 52 million people living right now inside the United States were not born in this country. That's a huge number, huge number. And it's probably not the whole number. There's probably more. We don't know who's here. So that has to happen. You need to begin finding out who's here, but you have to enforce the law. I listen to people all the time say, well, you know, we need new laws and so forth. Wait a minute. Look at the laws that are on the books. We don't enforce them. We've got to do that. You do that, and I would tell you that at least 50 to 80% of your concerns with China will go away. The Chinese are not a warlike people. They have no history of waging war against anybody. In fact, if you go back to the last 500 years of Chinese history, all but 311 to 318 of those 500 years, China was occupied and ruled by foreigners. The Chinese have routinely been the victim of invasion and occupation. And there's a very good reason for that. China, for most of the last 2,000 years, has been the wealthiest country in the world. There are no communists in China. Anybody who starts talking about the Communist Party, tell them to shut up. There is no such animal. There's a party, a one-party state. It's more of a fascist state with a fascist economy, with state-controlled capitalism. But the Chinese are the most brilliant capitalists in the history of mankind. Given the opportunity, they are going to be the wealthiest country in the world. That does not make them a threat unless you don't protect your borders, unless you have a class of entrepreneurs, a ruling class in the United States that's willing to sell us out. Remember all those jobs and all those factories that we had? They started disappearing in the 80s. By the time you got to 2000, most of them were gone. Well, how did that happen? Is it because the Chinese came over and said, please, let's buy you out? Absolutely not. Our ruling class, our class of CEOs and entrepreneurs, they're the ones that said, let's put all these Americans out of work. We'll put them on welfare. We'll give them freebies, and we'll move everything to China. We'll make a killing. Cheap labor, lots of money. Forget it. That's how we lost our manufacturing base. Right now, we have Chinese that want to buy our farmland. If you let them, the Chinese will buy everything.
Yeah.
So who's going to stop it? You don't have to go to war with China to stop this. You have to stop it here at home. Now, when they talk about the armed forces, well, China is building up armed forces. A third or more of the so-called Chinese Navy is a big Coast Guard. Secondly, there are no Chinese armies gathering ready to invade Taiwan. There are no Chinese armies trying to invade Southeast Asia. The Chinese absolutely loathe and despise North Korea. They have no intention of helping the North Koreans do anything. And they've told the North Koreans, if you start a war, you're on your own. The hell with you. They would like to do business with South Korea. They'd like to see South Korea inherit the peninsula. Just as in the early 90s, the old Communist Party of the Soviet Union decided they were better off if Germany were under West Germany instead of East Germany. You have the same phenomenon in Asia today. The problem is we have troops on the ground in South Korea, and the Chinese want those to leave. And we should leave. We've been there for 70 years. What is Korea, the 51st state? These people have one of the most successful economies in the world. The Koreans are brilliant. You know, you want to see brand new airports and fabulous railroads, brilliant laboratories and manufacturing facilities, visit South Korea. When President Trump visited Japan, he said, you know, I don't know why we have all these troops here. Why are we defending Japan? The Japanese are successful. They have a tremendous society, successful economy. They don't need us. He was right. We need to get out of these places in Asia. We need to demilitarize our relations with Asia. We should be doing business in Asia, not threatening anybody. And if somebody says to you, well, didn't you see what those Chinese did to the Filipinos that were trying to fish in waters? You know what? The Filipinos and the Vietnamese and the Malays and the Indonesians and the Thais and the Cambodians, they need to sort that out with the Chinese. And every time that they try to, the Chinese back off. Right now, the Chinese are establishing hotlines from Beijing into all the major countries of Southeast Asia. They've already got it with Vietnam. Remember, there was a time when Vietnam went to war with China?
Yeah.
And what happened? The Chinese lost. The Chinese aren't very good at that sort of thing. They never have been. What they do best is make money. So we need to correct our assumptions. And as far as Taiwan is concerned, there's no difference between Taiwan and the mainland in terms of their views and attitudes and opinions. The Taiwanese are just as rabid that they own the entire South China Sea as Beijing is. I mean, come on, this is ridiculous. Why are we backing one country's claim to an entire sea? That's ridiculous. Let the people that live in that part of the world work these things out. We don't need to be involved.
That is something that really hits me when I think about that, because yes, we have spent so much blood and treasure everywhere. Now I want to ask you sort of a personal question. What price have you paid for these opinions that go against the norm? I mean, you were in the military, you have seen this, you have been, but you're not operating on the same level as all these other people. What price have you paid for that?
Well, I think it's had its benefits as well as its downsides. Obviously, money is to be made in Washington if you unconditionally support all the military interventions, if you unconditionally support the massive spending on defense and on everything else. Washington is a place where everything is about spending money. If you go to the Hill, they'll tell you, we exist to spend money. If we don't spend money, what do we do? Well, you also can't make any money if you're in politics unless you spend money, because you're in the business of cultivating support. You want support from donors, you want to be reelected. It's all about money.
Yeah.
So that's, in that sense, I'm certainly not going to become a millionaire because of anything I've said or done in Washington, D.C. On the other hand, I think there is a growing awareness of the problems that we have in Washington and that we're on a very dangerous path. And I think enough Americans have died in enough places for very bad reasons that they don't need to die anymore. And that we need to be concerned about what's happening here at home. And that means we have to guard our borders. We have to guard our littoral waters. We need to ensure we're enforcing the law and we're protecting our farmland, protecting the mines that we own, the mineral deposits, the oil, the gas. We need to be concerned about our country, our standard of living, our wealth, the education we provide. All of these things should be number one. That's where we should focus. The rest of the world is largely going to take care of itself. I know that's a shock, but until we came around, there were about 5,000 years of recorded history. And they seem to get along, not always successfully, but that's their problem. And that was the message that George Washington and the people that founded this country said. We don't want to be entangled in other people's wars and miseries. And the real mission of the United States was always to be the world's engine of prosperity, because Washington and Hamilton and others said, if we are successful, truly successful, we build a prosperous and just society, others will admire us and emulate us. We don't need to march into anybody's country and convert them to democracy at the point of a bayonet. That's a dumb idea. And they oppose that. We need to stop that.
Well, you know what? I've sat here and got an education for 39 minutes, and I really appreciate what you've done and talking and being a different voice, because everything marches to one tune, and it's like you're crying out into the wilderness, and I I love that. I love that when my brothers and sisters in arms do that. I do appreciate that. So thank you so much for giving me a shot. I really appreciate it. Can you stick around after the show real quick?
Well, I have to go, but I appreciate your invitation, and perhaps we can do this again in the future.
I
And
look
my
forward
best to everybody, all the veterans out there, because they have a very important role to play. They're the ones that need to stand up and say, wait a minute, what are we doing? Why are we doing it? We haven't had those questions asked for a long time, and there better be a damn good reason for American blood and treasure to be spilled all over the world. And I don't think the reasons have been very good.
Yeah, yeah, I agree. I agree.
Okay.
Thank
All the
you.
best. God
Bye bye.
bless you.